Before the sun rises, before the world awakens, there are men who stand in darkness, carrying a burden most will never understand. This is their story. This is Rangers at Dawn. There is a stillness that exists before violence, a paradox so profound it defies ordinary understanding. In these final minutes before dawn, peace and war occupy the same moment, the same breath, the same beating heart. Fear and duty collide in silence so complete that even the wind seems to hold its breath. No words are spoken because none are needed, and perhaps because no words exist that could capture what each man feels standing in this darkness. Each ranger knows what comes next, knows it with a certainty that reaches beyond thought into the primal core of human awareness. They know that in moments the world will explode into chaos, that silence will shatter into screams and gunfire, that some among them will fall and never rise again. This knowledge sits heavy in their chests, presses against their ribs with every controlled breath, reminds them with each heartbeat that they are standing on the edge of permanence. This is the weight before the light, the burden carried by men who have volunteered to be first into hell. First to face what waits in the darkness beyond the horizon. Visual, close-ups of equipment checks. Hands trembling slightly but performing with precision. Rangers are not superhuman, though civilians often imagine them as such. They bleed when cut, fear when threatened, doubt when faced with impossible odds. Their hearts race before combat, just as any heart would. Their hands tremble with adrenaline they cannot fully control. Their minds scream warnings their training has taught them to override. But they are warriors, shaped by something deeper than physical prowess or tactical skill. They are men forged in the furnace of suffering, tempered by experiences that would break ordinary souls, hardened not by glory or medals or recognition, but by the daily choice to endure what most cannot even imagine. They have learned to function within fear, to perform despite terror clawing at their throats, to move forward when every instinct demands retreat. This is the Ranger ethos, not a motto shouted in training, but a truth lived in the darkest hours. They choose to stand when the world would forgive them for running. They choose duty over survival, mission over safety, brothers over self. And in making these choices, they become something more than men, something less than gods, something uniquely and terribly American in its stubborn refusal to yield. Every dawn raid carries the weight of permanence, a finality that no amount of preparation can diminish. Some men standing in this darkness will never see another sunrise, never feel warmth on their faces again, never return to the lives they left behind when they volunteered for this mission. They know this truth with absolute clarity. They accepted it when they pinned on the Ranger tab, when they raised their right hands and swore oaths that meant more than words, when they looked into mirrors and saw reflected back not who they were, but who they had chosen to become. The question facing them now is not the civilian's question, not will I survive, because survival was never guaranteed, and hoping for it is a luxury combat does not afford. The question that matters, the only question that carries weight in these final moments is this: will I do my duty when it matters most? Will I stand when standing means death? Will I protect my brothers even if protection costs me everything? This is the burden of the Ranger at dawn, the terrible privilege of men who have accepted responsibility for violence so that others might sleep in peace. Stephen E. Ambrose spent decades studying American warriors, walking the battlefields where they fought, interviewing the men who survived and honoring those who did not. He observed something fundamental about courage that most misunderstand. He wrote that the real hero is the man who fights even when he is scared, who moves forward despite terror, who performs his duty while his mind screams for escape. Rangers at dawn embody this quiet, terrifying courage in its purest form. They do not feel brave in these moments. They feel mortal, vulnerable, afraid. But they have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. That heroism lives not in fearlessness, but in the choice to stand when fear would justify retreat. Karl Marlantes, who led Marines through the hell of Vietnam, revealed another truth that Rangers know intimately. He wrote of the razor edge between civilization and savagery, that thin line separating order from chaos, humanity from brutality. Dawn attacks blur these moral lines in the name of survival, force men to commit acts they never imagined themselves capable of, reveal capacities for both nobility and darkness that peacetime keeps hidden. Rangers walk this edge every time they prepare for first light, knowing that what they must do will change them forever. Knowing that the men who return from dawn assault will not be the same men who prepared for it in darkness. This is not a story of conquest, though conquests happened. This is not a story of glory, though glory was won. This is a story of men who carried the burden of being first, who accepted the terrible responsibility of standing between peace and chaos, between freedom and tyranny, between the lives civilians lead and the violence that would destroy those lives if left unchecked. They were first into hell when hell needed entering, first to bleed when bleeding was required, first to kill when killing became necessary, and first to question what they had become when the mission ended and silence returned, and they were left alone with memories of what they had done at dawn. This is their story, told not to glorify war, but to honor warriors. Not to romanticize violence, but to acknowledge the price paid by volunteers who chose to stand in darkness so others might wake in light. This is Rangers at Dawn, a truth written in blood and remembered in silence, a legacy carried by men who will never fully explain what they endured and never fully escape what they became. The hour before dawn assault is sacred in ways that defy civilian understanding, ritualistic in ways that transcend military protocol. In near-total darkness, Rangers move through preparation with practiced precision born from countless repetitions, from training that burned these movements into muscle memory so deep that thought becomes unnecessary. Weapons checked not once, but 3 times, because in combat a malfunction means death, and death means failure, and failure means brothers die. Magazines seated with firm pressure, the metallic click barely audible but felt through gloved hands. Bolts cycled to verify chambered rounds, the mechanical sound of steel on steel somehow comforting in its familiarity. Safety mechanisms tested, optics verified, backup systems confirmed. Every action performed in silence because sound carries in the pre-dawn stillness with unnatural clarity. And because words fail utterly to capture what each man feels in these moments, suspended between who he was and who he must become. The silence is not empty but full, heavy with unspoken thoughts and suppressed emotions, and the terrible knowledge that this preparation is not rehearsal but prologue to violence that will demand everything these men possess. Faces, painted with camouflage that serves dual purposes, tactical, concealment and psychological transformation. The paint is not for intimidation of enemies who cannot yet see them, but for the man applying it, a physical marker of transition from individual to warrior, from person with name and history to instrument of strategic violence. Rangers apply the paint with ritual care, fingers tracing patterns across cheeks and foreheads, transforming familiar features into masks of war. Some men pray as they paint, lips moving in silence to speak words meant only for God or fate or the universe that decides who lives and who dies when dawn breaks. They pray for courage, though they would never admit fear. They pray for protection, though they know bullets respect no prayers. They pray for their brothers beside them, that if death must come, it takes them instead, that if suffering must be endured, they bear it rather than watch it inflicted on men they love more than life itself. Others pray to no deity at all, but pray nonetheless, speaking to absent wives or children or parents who will never know the full truth of what their son does in darkness before dawn. These prayers are not about survival, but about meaning. About the desperate human need to believe that what comes next serves purpose larger than mere violence, that sacrifice might purchase something worth the cost it demands. The enemy is not yet visible. will not be visible for minutes yet, that stretch like hours in the subjective experience of men awaiting combat. But another war has already begun. A war older than nations or ideologies or political disputes that send armies into collision. This is the war inside each man's mind, the battle between training and instinct, between duty and survival, between what must be done and what the soul resists doing. Terror is a living thing in these moments, not a concept, but a physical presence that manifests in racing heartbeats and constricted throats and the cold sweat that soaks through uniforms despite the chill of pre-dawn air. It crawls up the spine with insect persistence, tightens the chest until breathing becomes conscious effort, accelerates thought into spirals that must be forcibly controlled before they spin into panic. Rangers have learned to function within this fear, to perform despite it rather than in its absence, to accept terror as the price of admission to combat and proceed anyway because mission demands it and brothers depend on it, and there exists no alternative that honor can accommodate. They breathe in patterns taught by instructors who knew that controlled breathing steadies the mind, slows the heart, returns agency to men whose bodies betray them with autonomic responses to mortal threat. In and out, measured and deliberate, each breath a small victory over biology that screams to run. Each man battles his own demons while projecting strength to the brothers beside him. A performance required by unwritten rules of warrior culture that forbid admission of weakness, even when weakness would be rational and admission would be honest. No one admits fear because to do so would be to give it power, to make it real in a way that internal experience does not, to risk infection spreading through the unit like disease through a compromised immune system. So they wear masks more effective than camouflage paint, masks of calm confidence and steady hands and eyes that reveal nothing of the chaos behind them. They joke quietly, voices too low to carry beyond their immediate circle, humor serving as pressure release and connection and proof that they remain human, despite training designed to suppress humanity in favor of lethality. They check each other's gear with hands that move with practiced efficiency, tightening straps and securing pouches and verifying that every piece of equipment sits exactly where it should, because in combat seconds matter, and fumbling for misplaced tools means death. They lie to each other with reassuring glances and confident nods, lies that say everything will be fine, and we have done this before, and today will be no different than training. And somehow, through mechanisms that psychology cannot fully explain, these lies become truth when dawn breaks and bullets fly, and the only reality that matters is the reality they create. Through shared belief in each other's capability and commitment, the heaviest burden in these final minutes belongs not to the men who will enter the kill zone, but to the man who will send them there. The commander who bears responsibility, not just for his own survival, but for the lives of every ranger under his authority. Commanders do not measure leadership in strategies devised in comfortable rooms far from battle, or in objectives marked with pins on maps that reduce human complexity to geometric abstraction. They measure it in lives spent, in the knowledge that when dawn breaks and orders are given and the assault begins, some of these men standing before him now will not return. Some will die instantly, mercifully, without time to understand what happened. Others will die slowly, screaming, beyond the reach of medics who risk everything trying to save them. Still others will return physically intact but spiritually destroyed, carrying wounds invisible to any examination but fatal nonetheless to the men they were before combat. The commander knows all this with certainty that sits like lead in his stomach, that makes sleep impossible in the nights before operations, that transforms command from privilege to curse. There is no training adequate for this responsibility. No manual that teaches how to send men into calculated chaos where death waits with mathematical certainty for some percentage of those who enter. No course that prepares a commander for the moment he must look into the eyes of men he trained, men he knows, men whose families he has met at ceremonies and gatherings, and order them toward violence that will kill some of them, regardless of skill or courage or preparation. The decision is tactical necessity, strategic imperative, the cold calculus of war that trades lives for objectives and measures success in ground gained rather than blood spilled. But it is also deeply, terribly personal. These are not abstract soldiers, but individual men with names and histories and futures that depend on decisions the commander makes in darkness before dawn. He balances mission necessity against human cost, knowing the balance is impossible. Knowing that no matter how carefully he plans, some will die, and he will carry responsibility for their deaths for the rest of his life. This is the commander's dawn, darker than any soldier's, because he carries not just his own fear, but the accumulated weight of theirs. Not just his own potential death, but the certainty of deaths he will cause through orders given. In the final moments before assault, there are no speeches of the kind that movies depict, no heroic declarations about duty or freedom or the righteousness of cause. Hollywood gets this wrong, reduces to dramatic monologue what is actually profound silence, transforms contemplation into performance. Real warriors do not need words when death is imminent and action approaches. Words become inadequate, trivial, a distraction from the internal work each man must do to prepare himself for what comes next. They need only breath, steady and controlled, proof that they remain in command of bodies that want to flee. They breathe in patterns that calm the sympathetic nervous system, that override millions of years of evolution, screaming that remaining in place when threat approaches is insanity, that survival demands retreat, and only fools stand ground when ground becomes killing field. But they breathe and they stay, because training conquered instinct and duty, superseded survival. And they decided long ago that being rangers meant accepting risks that rational minds reject. They exist in a suspended state between who they were and who they must become, caught in the liminal space where civilian identity has not yet fully transformed into warrior persona, but can no longer return to what it was. Each man feels the crushing awareness that everything changes at first light, that there is life before this dawn and whatever comes after. But there is no going back to innocence or ignorance, or the comfortable illusions that allow civilians to sleep peacefully. Dawn will demand actions that cannot be undone, will create memories that cannot be forgotten, will forge them into men fundamentally different from who they were when darkness fell. They know this. They have always known this. But knowing intellectually and experiencing viscerally are different things entirely, separated by the gulf between anticipation and reality that can only be crossed through action. So they wait in silence that feels eternal, though it measures only minutes on watches that tick toward inevitable violence. They check weapons one final time, though weapons have already been checked. They adjust gear that needs no adjustment. They perform small rituals that serve no tactical purpose, but provide psychological comfort. Human need for control, asserting itself through meaningless actions that are meaningful precisely because they are chosen rather than imposed. The sky begins to lighten with inexorable certainty, dawn approaching whether men are ready or not, whether they have made peace with what comes or not, whether they feel brave or terrified or both simultaneously. Imperceptibly at first, the blackness of night yields to the grey of pre-dawn, shadows becoming visible where before there was only void. Then undeniably, light spreads across the eastern horizon like blood in water, inevitable and unstoppable and beautiful in the way that terrible things can be beautiful when stripped of context. Dawn is coming with all it implies, with all it demands, with all it will take from men who chose to stand in its path. And with it comes hell, not metaphorical but literal, not abstract but visceral, the hell of combat where theories become bodies and strategies, become screams and plans, become chaos that demands improvisation from men whose training must now prove sufficient or prove fatal. This is the hour before hell. This is preparation in darkness. This is the final moment of peace before the storm breaks and transforms everything it touches. Rangers stand ready not because they are unafraid, but because fear no longer matters. Not because they are certain of survival, but because survival has become secondary to duty. They stand because brothers stand beside them, and leaving brothers is unthinkable. They stand because they swore oaths, and oaths mean something to men who measure themselves by kept promises. They stand because someone must stand first, and they volunteered to be that someone, accepted that burden, embraced that responsibility. Dawn breaks, the sky lightens, time compresses, and in moments that feel like eternity and pass like seconds, everything changes. Silence detonates into gunfire with violence that shocks even men trained to expect it, prepared for it. Veterans who have experienced it before and still find themselves momentarily stunned by the sheer intensity of combat's opening moments. The world explodes into sound and light and movement so overwhelming that the human mind cannot fully process it, can only react with trained responses that bypass conscious thought entirely. This is the moment all preparation led to. The culmination of months of training and years of commitment and seconds of prayer whispered in darkness. This is first light transformed into first blood, dawn becoming synonymous with death, the moment that justifies every sacrifice made to reach it and demands even greater sacrifices yet to come. There is no gradual escalation, no gentle transition from peace to violence, no opportunity to adjust or acclimate or prepare psychologically for what unfolds, or does not ease you into its embrace. It hits like freight trains, hit objects on tracks, with unstoppable momentum and devastating force, and absolute indifference to the fragility of what it strikes. 1 second, Rangers stand breathing in darkness, hearts pounding but bodies still, minds focused on final checks and last thoughts. The next second they are running through fire toward men trying to kill them, toward objectives that must be taken regardless of cost, toward violence that will test everything they believe about themselves and reveal truths they will spend lifetimes trying to forget. This is the Ranger assault. This is dawn weaponized, morning transformed into tactical advantage, first light used to blind enemies who have grown accustomed to darkness. Rangers move with speed, born from desperation and training so intensive it transformed movement into instinct. They advance through terrain, memorized from maps and aerial photographs, terrain that looks nothing like maps suggested, and everything like chaos embodies. Explosions throw dirt and debris into air, thick with smoke and cordite, creating visibility conditions that make navigation more intuition than observation. Tracers arc through grey dawn light like malevolent fireflies, each one carrying death to whoever stands in its path, each one fired by men who want to go home as desperately as the Rangers advancing toward them. Machine guns open fire from positions intelligence failed to identify, from bunkers that should not exist, according to briefings delivered hours ago by men who will never face the consequences of their mistakes. Mortars impact with concussive force that rattles organs inside rib cages, that throws men to ground regardless of whether shrapnel hits them, that creates pressure waves felt more than heard by ears, already deafened by the overwhelming cacophony of battle. The human mind is not built for this level of sensory input, was never designed by evolution to process violence occurring at this speed and intensity and proximity. The smell of cordite becomes so pervasive it saturates everything, sharp and chemical and burning, coating the back of the throat with acrid residue that makes breathing feel like drowning in smoke. The taste of dirt mixed with blood becomes unavoidable as Rangers hit the ground again and again, faces pressed into soil, churned by explosions and watered by the blood of men who fell seconds or minutes before. Metallic and wrong, the taste of combat is one no Ranger ever fully eliminates from sense memory, one that returns unbidden years later, triggered by smells or tastes that bear only passing resemblance to battlefield reality. The deafening roar that surrounds them makes communication impossible through normal means. reduces complex tactics to hand signals and intuitive understanding and the wordless coordination of men who have trained together so long they function as single organism rather than collection of individuals. Ears ring with sustained tones that will never fully fade, tinnitus becoming permanent companion to veterans who spent even minutes in conditions like these. Rangers cannot think in any conventional sense, cannot pause to consider options or evaluate alternatives or weigh decisions with rational deliberation. They can only react with responses so deeply ingrained that action precedes conscious awareness of. Stimulus training becomes muscle memory, becomes survival in transformation, so complete that individual identity nearly vanishes in favor of pure function. Rangers move through kill zones not because they feel brave in these moments, but because months ago, in training that broke them down and built them back differently, they learned to move while afraid. They learned that courage is not feeling but action, not absence of fear, but capacity to function despite fear's presence. They internalize patterns of movement and fire discipline and tactical thinking so thoroughly that these patterns execute automatically when conscious mind becomes overwhelmed by sensory overload and emotional intensity. A ranger sees movement and targets it before recognizing what he saw. He responds to threats before his conscious mind registers them as threats. He performs actions he will not remember performing, will have no conscious recollection of decisions that saved his life and the lives of brothers near him. This is not heroism as civilians imagine it, not deliberate choice to act courageously in the face of danger. This is something deeper and stranger and more fundamental. The complete transformation of human being into weapon guided by training implanted so deeply it functions below the level of conscious thought. There is a military axiom repeated in every tactical, school and planning session and after-action review, an axiom so well known it has become cliché, but remains no less true for its repetition. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. At dawn, this axiom stops being abstract wisdom and becomes visceral, immediate, undeniable truth written in blood and chaos, and the frantic improvisation of men whose carefully rehearsed assault disintegrates within seconds of initiation. The carefully coordinated assault that looked elegant on maps and flawless in rehearsals fractures within heartbeats of first shots fired, shatters into fragments that bear little resemblance to the plan briefed hours ago. Enemy positions are not where intelligence reports placed them, not where aerial reconnaissance suggested, not where logic and experience predicted. Bunkers appear that should not exist. Fields of fire overlap in patterns that were not anticipated. Terrain that looked passable from photographs becomes impassable under actual examination, forcing detours that expose rangers to fire from angles they did not prepare to defend against. Communications fail or become garbled or simply cannot be heard over the sustained roar of combat that drowns out everything except explosions and screams. Rangers adapt or die, and the speed of this adaptation determines who survives and who becomes casualty statistics in reports filed after the battle ends. Improvisation becomes the only doctrine that matters, the only guide available to men, whose training must now prove flexible enough to accommodate reality's refusal to conform to expectations. Squads that train to operate as cohesive units splinter into fire teams when terrain or casualties or enemy action makes squad integrity impossible to maintain. Fire teams fragment into pairs when circumstances demand it, when staying together means death and separation offers slim chance of survival that together does not. Pairs become individuals, fighting for inches of ground when there is no alternative, when brothers fall or become separated or get pinned down in positions that cannot be supported. Each ranger becomes his own tactical command, making life and death decisions with information incomplete and time non-existent and consequences immediate. This is not the clean, organized warfare of briefing rooms where colonels move markers on maps and discuss operations in language of doctrine and procedure. This is survival measured in heartbeats and breaths, and the split-second decisions that separate living rangers from dead ones. In this chaos that defies prediction and mocks planning, men perform impossible acts born not from courage, as philosophers define it, but from desperation, as soldiers experience it. Not for medals that will be awarded in ceremonies months or years later, ceremonies where survivors stand uncomfortable in dress uniforms and wish they were anywhere else. Not for recognition or glory or the respect of civilians who will thank them for service they cannot begin to understand, but because their brothers' lives depend on split-second decisions made under fire, decisions that must be correct despite absence of information and presence of terror, and the absolute certainty that choosing wrong means watching friends die. A medic sprints through crossfire to reach a wounded ranger, screaming for help that may come too late, screaming not from cowardice, but from wounds so severe that silence becomes physically impossible. The medic runs, not because he is fearless, not because he has calculated odds and determined the risk acceptable, but because that ranger would do the same for him, because leaving a brother to die alone is unthinkable, because the contract between rangers supersedes every consideration, including self-preservation. He runs knowing he draws fire, knowing that enemy gunners will target him specifically, because killing medics multiplies casualties through demoralization and through deprivation of care to wounded who might otherwise survive. He runs anyway. A soldier stays in an exposed position to cover his squad's advance, providing suppressive fire that gives brothers the seconds they need to move from one covered position to another. Seconds that might mean survival, or might mean nothing if enemy fire finds them anyway. He stays knowing he draws attention, knowing that muzzle flashes from his weapon provide targeting reference for every enemy who can see him, knowing the mathematics of combat dictate that stationary targets die with much higher probability than moving ones. He knows the odds and stays anyway, not from suicidal impulses, but from calculation colder than civilians can comprehend. His life weighed against multiple brothers' lives equals no choice at all, equals obvious decision that requires no deliberation. He stays because mathematics and morality align for once, because this is what rangers do. Because the alternative of watching brothers die while he remains safe is not alternative. His psychology can accommodate. This is not heroism in any romantic sense. This is brotherhood, manifested in the only language war understands, the language of sacrifice measured in blood and lives spent to purchase seconds for men you love more than safety. And then, in fleeting glimpses that burn themselves into memory with permanence no amount of time will erase. Rangers see it clearly despite chaos and violence and the tunnel vision that combat induces. Fear in enemy eyes, the same fear they carry. Young faces contorted not with hatred or fanaticism, but with terror identical to what they feel, what they fight to control, what threatens to overwhelm training and duty and every rational thought. Trembling hands trying to reload weapons with fingers that refuse to cooperate, that fumble magazines and drop rounds and betray owners with autonomic responses to mortal threat. The uncomfortable, undeniable truth that monsters do not exist on battlefields, despite what propaganda suggests and civilians believe and soldiers wish were true, because killing monsters is easy while killing men is not. Only men exist here, men forced by circumstance beyond their control, by duty they accepted or had imposed, by politics and history and decisions made by leaders who will never face the consequences of orders they issued. Only men forced to kill each other at dawn, to end lives of other men who are someone's son, someone's brother, someone's father, someone who also prayed before dawn, broke and hoped to survive and wanted nothing more than to go home to people who love them. This recognition does not stop the killing, because recognition changes nothing about tactical reality. Nothing about the fact that one side must die for the other to complete mission and return home. Cannot stop the killing because pausing means death, because mercy in combat gets brothers killed, because war strips away every luxury, including the luxury of treating enemies as human beings, rather than threats to be eliminated. But this recognition brands itself into memory with permanence that defies every attempt at suppression or rationalization or the psychological distance soldiers try to maintain between actions performed and their moral implications. The face of the enemy becomes the face of someone's son in memory that will replay uninvited for decades, in dreams that wake rangers screaming, in quiet moments when mind wanders and finds itself back at dawn, facing a young man whose eyes held the same fear and who died anyway because duty demanded it. Someone's brother who will never return home, whose family will grieve as ranger families grieve, whose absence will create hole in lives of people who loved him exactly as rangers are loved by people who wait for them. Someone who also prayed before dawn, who whispered words meant for God or fate or loved ones he hoped to see again, who wanted to survive with desperation equal to any ranger's desire for survival. This is war's cruelest lesson. The truth that both sides are human and both must die anyway. The recognition that makes killing necessary but not righteous, unavoidable but not justified. The cost of mission success measured not just in friendly casualties, but in the humanity sacrificed by survivors who must live with what they did to men who did not deserve death any more than they deserved to inflict it. Rangers learn this lesson at dawn, learn it in ways that can never be unlearned, that transform them permanently into men who understand what civilians cannot, what leaders who order wars will never face, what philosophers debate without comprehending. They learn that war is not adventure or glory or test of courage. War is hell, and hell is watching the light fade from eyes that moments before held fear identical to your own. There comes a moment in every battle when institutional training yields to something older, something that predates military doctrine and tactical manuals and the structured hierarchies that govern peacetime operations. Something primal emerges from beneath the veneer of civilization, something tribal and ancient and fundamentally human that transforms soldiers into something else entirely. This transformation is invisible to outside observers, leaves no physical evidence, creates no measurable change in appearance or behavior that cameras could capture or historians could document. But it is absolute in its completeness, total in its restructuring of motivation and priority and the internal calculus that determines action. Rangers stop fighting for strategy devised in headquarters, distant from bullets and blood. Stop fighting for nation, though they love their country and believe in what it represents and would defend it against any threat. Stop fighting for objectives marked on maps with pins and annotations, objectives that seemed important in briefing rooms but become abstractions when brothers are bleeding. The mission becomes secondary. The brotherhood becomes everything. This is when soldiers become something warfare manuals cannot describe and military theory cannot predict. Not warriors serving institutional purposes, but protectors defending family. A family forged not by blood relation or shared geography or cultural inheritance, but by shared suffering so intense. It creates bonds deeper than any that biology produces. This transformation happens without announcement or deliberation, without conscious decision or formal declaration. One moment, Rangers are executing tactical plans according to doctrine and training and the orders given by commanders who understand strategy. The next moment, doctrine becomes irrelevant and orders become background noise, and the only thing that matters is the man bleeding beside you, the brother pinned down by fire ahead of you, the ranger who fell and needs extraction before enemy forces can reach his position. The shift is instinctive and complete, overriding years of training that emphasized mission accomplishment above all other considerations. Training that taught Rangers to accept casualties as inevitable cost of operations, to continue advancing even when brothers fall, to prioritize objectives over individuals. All that training, all those lessons drilled into consciousness through repetition and reinforcement, and the authority of instructors who knew that mission focus keeps units effective, all of it vanishes in the face of primal need to protect the tribe. Not warriors serving a country, but members defending family become the reality of Rangers under fire. And this reality supersedes every consideration, including strategic necessity and tactical advantage, and their own survival. What emerges from this primal bond defies rational explanation, challenges every model of human behavior that assumes self-preservation as fundamental motivation. Men drag wounded comrades under fire through kill zones where survival is measured in seconds, and movement means exposure to enemies who concentrate fire on anyone foolish enough to present themselves as targets. They do not calculate odds or perform risk assessment or weigh potential benefits against probable costs. They do not pause to consider that saving one wounded ranger might result in 2 casualties if the rescuer dies in the attempt. That cold mathematics suggests leaving the wounded where they fell and continuing mission. They act because leaving a brother behind is not an option their souls can accommodate. Because the contract between Rangers includes provisions more sacred than any written in legal documents or military regulations. They act because that Ranger would do the same for them. Because reciprocity is fundamental to warrior culture. Because the tribe protects its members with absolute commitment that does not calculate cost or consider alternatives. They drag broken bodies through fire that shreds vegetation and kicks up dirt and finds flesh with terrible frequency. Drag them despite their own wounds, despite exhaustion that makes every movement agony, despite the rational voice screaming that this is suicide and saving one life is not worth losing 2. Rangers cover retreats with their bodies when circumstances demand it. When tactical withdrawal requires someone to stay behind and provide suppressive fire that gives others the seconds they need to reach safety. They stand exposed to draw fire away from wounded men who cannot move, cannot defend themselves, can only lie helpless while brothers risk everything to protect them from enemies who show no mercy to the defenseless. They stay in collapsing positions when survival screams to run, when every instinct demands retreat, when remaining means certain death or capture and fleeing means probable survival. They stay because mathematics cold enough to freeze blood still produces clear answer when one life weighed against multiple lives. They stay because this is what Rangers do, what they have always done, what they will continue doing as long as Rangers exist and brothers need protecting. They stay because the alternative, watching brothers die while they remain safe, while they preserve themselves at cost of those they swore to protect, is not alternative. Their psychology can accommodate without fundamental destruction of identity. Better to die as Rangers than live as cowards becomes not dramatic declaration, but simple statement of fact. Description of choice, so obvious it requires no deliberation. This is not courage, as civilians understand the concept, not the romantic notion of bravery that movies depict and novels describe and memorial speeches invoke. This is love expressed in the only vocabulary available in combat, love stripped of sentiment and poetry and every gentle expression that peacetime affords. This is love as action rather than feeling, love as sacrifice without hesitation, love as protection without calculation of cost. This is the love that philosophers spend lifetimes trying to define, and theologians build entire belief systems around, and poets attempt to capture in verses that always fall short of reality. It is love that asks nothing and gives everything, love that endures beyond life itself, love that transforms death from tragedy into meaning. Rangers discover at dawn what most humans never learn, that the deepest form of love is not romantic passion or familial affection, or even the bond between parent and child. The deepest love is the willingness to die so that others might live, to sacrifice self so completely that the distinction between individual and tribe dissolves entirely. This is the love forged in fire, tempered by combat, proven through actions that speak more clearly than any words ever could. Between rangers exists an unspoken contract more sacred than any oath sworn at enlistment, more binding than any legal document or military regulation or code of conduct written by lawyers and commanders. This contract is never written down because writing it would diminish it, never spoken aloud because speaking it would profane it, never formally acknowledged because formal acknowledgement would reduce it to mere agreement rather than fundamental truth about what it means to be a ranger. The contract consists of 3 words that every ranger understands without instruction. 3 words that define the brotherhood and separate rangers from ordinary soldiers and create bonds that last until death and beyond. I will not leave you. Not while I am breathing. Not while I can crawl. Not while consciousness remains. Not ever. This promise transcends military code that authorizes commanders to leave the dead behind when tactical necessity demands it, that permits withdrawal when casualties become unsustainable, that acknowledges the harsh reality that sometimes saving everyone is impossible, and choices must be made about who lives and who gets left behind. The contract between rangers acknowledges no such calculations, permits no such choices, accepts no circumstances that justify leaving a brother behind. This contract is why rangers perform superhuman acts that defy belief, that seem impossible until witnessed, that challenge every assumption about human limitations under stress. Why men with shattered legs drag themselves back into fire instead of seeking cover and medical aid, drag themselves because brothers still fight, and abandoning them is unthinkable. Why rangers with minutes left to live spend those minutes covering retreats instead of trying to preserve themselves, spend their final breaths protecting others rather than praying for salvation. Why the last round in a magazine is never for surrender but for protecting brothers. Why rangers fight until ammunition exhausts and then fight with knives and fists and teeth if necessary, because surrender means abandoning wounded who cannot be moved, and abandonment violates the contract. This is the foundation of Ranger Brotherhood, the bedrock on which everything else builds, the promise kept when everything else has failed. When plans collapse and orders become impossible to follow and command structure disintegrates under enemy fire and every rational reason for continuing the fight disappears, the contract remains. I will not leave you becomes the only order that matters, the only guidance necessary, the only motivation required to keep fighting, when fighting seems futile and death seems certain and every survival instinct screams to flee. But this loyalty carries a terrible cost that no one discusses in training or mentions in recruitment materials or includes in the sanitized versions of combat that media presents to civilian audiences. Men die protecting corpses. They know, intellectually and tactically, and with certainty, that admits no doubt that the brother they are defending is gone. They saw the wound that killed him, saw the light fade from his eyes, know that no medical intervention can reverse what happened. They know that the body on the ground is empty vessel, that the person who inhabited it has departed, that staying to protect what remains serves no tactical purpose and violates every principle of sound military judgment. But they stay anyway, because leaving him violates something deeper than military code, something more fundamental than tactical doctrine, something that reaches into the core of what it means to be a ranger. Leaving him violates the contract that defines their identity, that gives meaning to their service, that separates them from soldiers who fight for pay or glory, or because they were conscripted and given no choice. Leaving him violates the promise they made, the promise that constitutes the foundation of brotherhood, the promise that says you will never be alone even in death, especially in death. We will bring you home or die trying. So they stay and fight over bodies that cannot be saved, bodies that tactical manuals say should be left behind for later recovery when battlefield conditions permit it. They take bullets defending men who are already dead, absorb wounds that will kill them or maim them or burden them with permanent disabilities, all to protect remains that enemy forces want as trophies or propaganda tools or simply as proof of kills accomplished. And they make this choice willingly, not from delusion that somehow their brother might still be saved, but from understanding that some things matter more than survival, that preserving your humanity requires honoring your promises even when cost becomes unbearable, that living with knowledge you left a brother behind is fate worse than death itself. The guilt of abandonment would poison every remaining day, would make survival into punishment rather than blessing, would transform them into men they could not respect or recognize or bear being. Better to die keeping the promise than live. Having broken it becomes simple truth that requires no debate, obvious conclusion that follows from premises accepted when they became rangers. This is war's greatest paradox, its most profound contradiction that philosophers and theologians, and anyone who thinks deeply about human nature, must confront. War, humanity's ultimate evil, the activity that concentrates suffering and death, and cruelty into intensities that nothing else matches. This same war produces humanity's purest form of love. Unconditional love that accepts no qualifications or limitations or circumstances under which it becomes void. Sacrificial love that gives without expecting return, that spends itself completely without regard for preservation or future benefit. Absolute love that endures not just until death, but through death and beyond death, into the memories of survivors who carry it forward through decades of peacetime existence. Love that asks nothing and gives everything. Love that finds its highest expression not in comfort or security or the gentle affections of peacetime, but in the willingness to die so that others might live. This paradox cannot be resolved or explained or rationalized into coherence. It simply exists as fundamental truth about human nature, about the capacities for both darkness and light that war reveals, about the strange alchemy that transforms suffering into meaning and sacrifice into purpose. Rangers at dawn discover what philosophers spend lifetimes seeking through abstract reasoning and logical argument and careful examination of ethical principles. They discover that meaning exists in connection, that individual existence finds its purpose in relationship to others, that the self becomes most fully realized not through preservation but through sacrifice for something larger than self. They discover that purpose lives in sacrifice rather than in accumulation, that lives measured by what was given rather than what was kept, are lives that matter in ways that selfish existence never can. They discover that the deepest love emerges, not despite suffering but because of it, that shared hardship creates bonds that comfort and prosperity never produce, that the willingness to endure hell for brothers transforms hell itself into something that carries meaning even as it destroys. This is the truth written in blood at first light, truth that no classroom can teach, and no book can fully convey, and no second-hand account can make real to those who have not experienced it. This is brotherhood forged in fire, love discovered in hell, the terrible beauty of warriors who found in war's worst moments the best of what humans can be. The assault succeeds. Objectives taken. Ground secured. Enemy forces eliminated or routed or surrendered, depending on circumstances that vary with each battle, but produce similar outcomes, measured in territory controlled and missions accomplished. In tactical terms, this is victory complete and unambiguous, the kind that commanders report to superiors and historians record in books and nations celebrate with parades and ceremonies. Mission accomplished appears in after-action reports filed by officers who reduce hours of chaos and terror into neat paragraphs that describe what happened without capturing what it felt like, what it cost, what it took from men who survived it. But Rangers standing in the aftermath do not feel like victors. though they stand on ground taken from enemies who fought desperately to hold it. They feel hollow, as if something essential was extracted during combat and cannot be recovered now that combat has ended. They feel exhausted beyond what physical exertion alone explains, fatigue that reaches into bones and soul, and the fundamental capacity to care about anything including their own survival. They feel empty in ways that worry them, because emptiness should not follow victory. Because winning should produce satisfaction or pride, or at least relief that the fighting is over and they are still alive. But victory tastes like ash when counted in lost friends, when the price of success is measured not in abstract casualties or percentages, or the clinical language of acceptable losses that commanders use to justify operations. When the price is measured in names, you will never speak again without feeling like someone punched you in the chest. Names that belong to men you trained with and fought beside and loved with intensity that civilians cannot comprehend. In jokes unfinished because the man who started them died before reaching the punchline, died in the middle of laughter that transformed instantly into silence. In promises broken by bullets that care nothing for intentions or commitments, or the futures men planned when they still believed planning mattered. This is the victory no training prepares you for, the kind that official reports will list as successful, but that feels like defeat to men who stand among its consequences. The kind that makes you wonder why you are still standing when better men fell. Braver men who deserved survival more than you do. Men with families waiting, and children who will grow up without fathers, and wives who will grieve for decades. This is victory that feels like defeat, because the cost of winning exceeded the value of what was won. Because ground taken cannot be worth the lives it cost to take it. Because no objective matters enough to justify the names now added to casualty lists. Dawn reveals what darkness hid. And rangers must walk among the aftermath that first light makes visible in every terrible detail. They move through the battlefield with mechanical steps, performing tasks that training demands and duty requires, but that souls resist with desperate intensity. The transformation is obscene in its totality, in its reduction of human beings to categorical designations that drain them of identity and history and the infinite complexity that made them who they were. Body counts become names. Statistics become brothers. Success becomes grief so overwhelming it threatens to crush men who thought they understood what war would cost, but who discover now that understanding was theoretical and reality is visceral, and the gap between them is unbridgeable. The man who joked with you an hour ago about girlfriend problems and bad coffee and the ridiculous dreams he had last night lies still now in ways that living men never lie still. Eyes open but seeing nothing, mouth slack in expression that holds no meaning because meaning requires consciousness, and consciousness has departed. The sergeant who saved your life in training, who pushed you past limits you thought were absolute, who believed in you when you did not believe in yourself, stares at nothing with eyes that will never close unless someone closes them, will never see anything again, though they remain technically intact. The kid who showed you pictures of his daughter just yesterday, who talked about the birthday party he would throw when he got home, who described in detail the doll he planned to buy her because she wanted it more than anything, will never see her grow up. Will never attend her birthday or her graduation or her wedding or any of the moments fathers live for, moments that give meaning to sacrifice and make hardship bearable. She will grow up with photographs instead of memories, with stories told by others instead of time spent together, with questions about her father that no one can answer completely, because knowing someone and explaining them are different things entirely. She will wonder if he loved her, and no one will be able to convey how much he did, how her photograph sustained him through horrors that would have broken men without something to fight for, how thoughts of her gave him reasons to survive when survival seemed impossible. This is what dawn reveals in light that earlier would have been merciful but now feels cruel, revealing what should remain hidden, forcing recognition of costs that war demands and victory requires. This is what dawn reveals, Not just tactical outcomes that appear in reports and history books, but human cost that appears nowhere except in memories of survivors, and grief of families and the empty chairs at tables where fallen rangers will never sit again. The algebra of war, where mission success and personal devastation occupy the same equation, where victory and loss become indistinguishable in morning light that shows everything and hides nothing, where winning and losing are revealed as false binary, as oversimplification that cannot capture the complex reality of operations that achieve objectives while destroying men who achieved them. Rangers learn that war has no winners in any meaningful sense, only survivors who carry forward the weight of what was lost, and the guilt of what they did, and the memories of what they witnessed. They learn that the language used to describe combat, language of victory and defeat and success and failure, is inadequate to reality that involves too much suffering and death and permanent damage to fit into categories designed for games and sports and contests where losing does not mean dying. Why am I standing? This question haunts every survivor, though most never speak it aloud. Keep it locked inside where it metastasizes into guilt and shame and the corrosive belief that their survival was undeserved, that they lived through random chance or cosmic error or some failure of justice that allowed wrong men to die. Why am I breathing when better men fell, men who deserved life more than I do, men whose survival would have meant more to more people than my survival means? Braver men who did not hesitate when I hesitated, who did not feel fear when I felt terror, who acted with certainty when I acted from training that barely overcame instinct screaming to flee. Stronger men who could have carried on, who could have continued serving, who had more to give and more to contribute and more value to offer than I possess. Men with families waiting, with wives who love them and children who need them, and parents who will be destroyed by news of their deaths. Men with futures planned in detail, with goals they intended to achieve and dreams they wanted to fulfill and lives they were building one day at a time. Men with reasons to live that outweigh my own reasons, that seem more important and more valuable and more worthy of whatever cosmic force decides who survives and who does not. This is the survivor's curse, the burden carried by everyone who walks away from battle while brothers remain behind. Guilt that no medal can absolve, because medals recognize actions performed rather than randomness survived. Because medals assume survival resulted from skill or courage, rather than luck that distributes itself without regard for who deserves it. No commendation can silence the voice that whispers in quiet moments that you should have died instead. That the universe made mistake in taking them and leaving you. That you stole breath and life and future that should have belonged to men who fell. The irrational but inescapable belief that you lived because you were lucky and they died because luck ran out. That survival is a zero-sum game where your life came at cost of theirs. That you somehow took what should have been theirs and left them with death you should have received. That you did something wrong or failed to do something right. That if you had acted differently or been braver or thought more clearly or moved faster, they would still be breathing, and you would be the one lying still in dawn light that reveals everything. This guilt becomes permanent resident in the survivor's soul, invisible to others, but weighing more than any physical wound, more than shrapnel or bullets or the injuries that at least have the courtesy to be visible and therefore comprehensible to people who want to help but do not know how. Personal effects collected in bags that will be shipped to families who expect them but are never ready for them, who will open packages and find watches still keeping time, and photographs creased from being carried in pockets and letters written but never sent. Final words imagined by men who did not hear them, who create in their minds the messages they wish they had received, the reassurances they needed, the wisdom they hoped dying men might share. Explanations impossible to formulate, because how? Do you write to a mother that her son died bravely when brave is word that means nothing in context of death? When bravery does not make death less final or less devastating or less wrong? What does bravely even mean when he screamed for her in the end? When pain overwhelmed training and morphine proved insufficient, and he called for his mother like children call for comfort that mothers cannot provide. When children die in wars, mothers did not start. How do you tell a wife her husband is a hero when he died terrified and alone, despite brothers nearby? When his last moments were not noble or peaceful, or anything like what she imagines? When the truth is that death in combat is ugly and painful, and nothing like movies suggest. These families expect heroes because society needs heroes, because the alternative is acknowledging that their loved ones died in chaos and terror for objectives that matter in strategic sense, but feel meaningless when measured against individual lives. They need heroes because heroism gives meaning to death that otherwise seems random and wasteful and unbearable. They need to believe death was clean and quick, and that their son or husband or father did not suffer, that he died doing what he loved, that he would not have wanted it any other way. The truth that war creates victims rather than legends, that death is never clean and often slow, and that no one wants to die no matter how much they believe in the mission, would shatter them, would take away the only comfort available to people. Grieving loss is so profound, they threaten to destroy the survivors. So Rangers carry two burdens from the battlefield, carry them for the rest of their lives without ever setting them down. The memory of how brothers actually died, the unvarnished truth of screams and blood, and the desperate fear in eyes that knew death was coming and could not prevent it. And the sanitized version they will tell families who need to believe death meant something, who need heroes rather than victims, who need narrative of sacrifice and honor rather than reality of chaos and randomness, and the simple fact that bullets kill without regard for who deserves to die and who deserves to live. This is another weight of victory, another cost not calculated in planning phases, or mentioned in mission briefings, or acknowledged in ceremonies where medals get pinned to chests of men who wish they were anywhere else. Becoming the curator of myths you know are lies, but tell anyway because the truth serves no one, because honesty would damage families already destroyed by loss, because sometimes mercy requires deception and love, demands that you carry the burden of truth alone, rather than sharing it with people who cannot bear it. Rangers become guardians of two histories, the one that actually happened and the one that gets told, and the gap between them is another wound that never heals, another source of isolation that separates survivors from everyone who was not there. Glory. It is a word used by those who were not there, spoken by politicians who send men to war, and civilians who thank them for service, and historians who write about battles decades after they occurred. Those who were there know only cost. They know that medals pinned to chests that feel nothing, that recognition provides no comfort, that awards and ceremonies and official gratitude cannot fill the emptiness left by brothers who died. They know that flags drape coffins of men who cannot see them, who do not care about flags or ceremonies or the honors bestowed on the dead by nations grateful for sacrifices made on their behalf. They know that glory is a story told by survivors, to make sense of senselessness, to impose meaning on events that resist meaning, to transform tragedy into narrative that serves purposes unrelated to truth. Glory is what civilians need to believe, exists because the alternative, that war is simply horror, that sometimes achieves necessary objectives, would make supporting wars impossible and honoring warriors feel hollow. At dawn, Rangers learn the truth that will separate them from civilians for the rest of their lives. There is no glory in war, only duty performed because someone must perform it. Only survival achieved through luck and training and the deaths of enemies who also wanted to survive. Only the crushing weight of living when others did not, of standing when better men fell, of breathing when breath itself feels like theft from those who can no longer breathe. This is what victory reveals. This is the shadow cast by first light. This is the cost of success measured not in ground gained or enemies defeated, but in names added to the endless list of those who will never see another dawn. The mission ends. Orders completed. Rangers extract from the battlefield, board transport that carries them away from territory bought with blood. But the war never ends. It travels home with them in ways that manifest slowly at first, and then with increasing intensity as time passes. The war lives in their gear, in equipment that smells like smoke and cordite even after cleaning. It lives in their minds, where memories replay without invitation, where sounds trigger responses that make no sense in peaceful contexts. It lives in the hypervigilance that becomes their new baseline existence, the permanent state of readiness that cannot be switched off. Because mechanisms evolved to keep them alive in combat do not recognize that combat has ended, they return to a world that expects normalcy, as if normalcy were a switch they could flip, as if transition from warrior to civilian required nothing more than changing clothes and crossing borders. Family dinners where relatives discuss topics that seem impossibly trivial to men who watched brothers die. Small talk about weather and television shows that civilians invest with importance Rangers cannot comprehend. Complaints about traffic or coffee that seem like problems from a different universe. Rangers smile because not smiling would hurt feelings of people who love them. They nod at appropriate moments because nodding is easier than explaining why nothing anyone says matters compared to memories that intrude constantly. This is the first battle after coming home, the battle to pretend you are still the person who left. But that person is gone, killed in ways that left no body to bury, no ceremony to mark his passing. He died at dawn, when innocence became impossible, and the transformation from civilian to warrior completed itself through exposure to realities that cannot be unseen or forgotten. Combat rewires the brain in ways neuroscience is only beginning to understand, creates new neural pathways designed for survival in environments where threats emerge without warning and hesitation means death. In war, hypervigilance keeps you alive. At home, it makes you a stranger in your own life. Rangers cannot turn this off, cannot stop the automatic scanning and threat assessment that continues regardless of context or rational knowledge that grocery stores do not contain enemy combatants. They sit in restaurants with backs to walls because backs exposed create vulnerability. They choose seats providing clear sightlines to exits because exits represent escape routes. They scan crowds for threats that do not exist. Their families try to understand why he cannot relax, why he tenses at loud noises, why he insists on specific seating arrangements. But understanding requires experience, and this experience is not shareable. A car backfires in parking lot, and civilians glance toward the sound with mild annoyance. Rangers hit the ground before conscious thought occurs, transported instantly back to dawn, to gunfire, to combat where similar sounds preceded death. Hearts race with adrenaline, hands reach for weapons that are not there. For several seconds, Rangers exist in two times simultaneously. Physically in parking lots surrounded by shoppers, mentally at dawn in combat, surrounded by threats that demand response. This is PTSD's cruelty, that the war never respects geography or time or the boundaries separating past from present. It follows you home, uninvited and impossible to exclude. It ambushes you in parking lots and birthday parties and quiet moments that should be peaceful, but never are. Civilians thank them for their service, mean it sincerely with gratitude that comes from genuine appreciation. Thank you for your service. 4 words repeated so frequently they have become ritual. And Rangers respond with polite acceptance because refusing would be rude. But each thank you creates distance rather than connection, widens the gap between those who served and those who did not. Because gratitude implies understanding, and there is no understanding this, no frame of reference that civilians possess that would allow them to grasp what Rangers experienced and carry forward. No shared language to communicate what dawn assault does to a soul, what killing does to your sense of self, what what watching brothers die does to your capacity to feel safe or connected. Rangers smile when civilians thank them, say you're welcome. But inside, they are screaming, because you cannot be grateful for an experience that destroyed who you were. Cannot accept thanks for doing things that haunt your dreams. Cannot bridge the gap between those who have killed and those who have not. The isolation is suffocating, complete. Rangers live among people, but feel entirely alone, surrounded by family who love them, but cannot reach them across distance that combat created. They long for connection, but cannot articulate their experience. So they withdraw, become ghosts in their own lives, present physically but absent emotionally. This is another casualty of dawn, the death of the person who existed before first light. But then a ranger sees another ranger. Eye contact happens, and something passes between them that requires no words. Recognition of the specific type of damage that comes from shared trauma. No words needed, they know. Only fellow rangers understand the language of that dawn, the weight carried, the cost paid. They can talk about it, though more often they do not, because talking feels unnecessary when understanding already exists. This is why ranger reunions feel more like home than actual homes. Why men who served together maintain contact across decades while relationships with civilians deteriorate. Because shared trauma becomes shared identity. These men become the only family that matters. Not because rangers want to exclude others, but because others cannot enter this space, cannot understand sentences left unfinished, silences that communicate volumes, references to events that need no explanation. This brotherhood becomes a lifeline, often the only thing preventing complete dissolution. Decades pass. Rangers age. They build lives around the wreckage of who they were, construct new identities from fragments of old ones. Some have families. Some achieve success in careers. Some find meaning in service to others. Others merely survive day by day, continuing because death would hurt people who love them. But one question never stops echoing regardless of how many decades pass. Was the cost justified? On good days, the answer is yes. Freedom requires guardians. Someone must stand first in darkness. The mission was necessary. On these days, rangers can see purpose in their reflections, can believe brothers who died brought something valuable with their lives. On bad days, and there are always bad days, the answer is no. Nothing justifies what was lost. On these days they see ghosts, men who died but kept breathing, soldiers who survived the assault but not the aftermath. The answer changes with each nightmare. Each anniversary, each brother lost to silence after the war. To suicide being the final casualty of dawn assaults that happened years before. This eternal question becomes the companion of every ranger who survives. Not a question they can answer, but a question they must live with. This is the long dawn. This is carrying the weight home. This is the cost that never appears in after-action reports. The price paid not once at sunrise, but every day thereafter, for the rest of their lives. For rangers, dawn became synonymous with sacrifice in ways that transcend metaphor or poetic language. Dawn is not simply a time of day, but a state of being, a permanent condition that rangers enter at first light and never fully leave regardless of how many years pass. That morning, whether it happened on the beaches of Normandy or in the jungles of Vietnam or in the deserts of Iraq or the mountains of Afghanistan, that morning does not pass into history the way ordinary mornings do. It repeats, in memory that intrudes without invitation, in nightmares that replay events with vivid detail, that leaves rangers disoriented about which reality is actual and which is remembered. In the permanent altered state of men who stood first in darkness and discovered what darkness contains. The sun rises every day with astronomical regularity. But for rangers, it never rises innocently again. Each dawn carries echoes of that dawn, sounds notes that remain inaudible to civilians who experience morning as beginning of day rather than reminder of transformation. Of brothers lost in those first moments when darkness yielded to light. Of choices made when time compressed and options narrowed. Of the moment they stopped being who they were and became who they had to be to survive what came next. Stephen E. Ambrose recognized a truth that civilians struggle to comprehend. He wrote that the soldier above all others prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds. Not the politicians who declare wars or the civilians who support them, but the soldier who stands in darkness before dawn and knows with absolute certainty that violence is coming. Rangers at Dawn embodied this paradox completely. Warriors who prayed for peace while preparing for violence. Men who carried scars invisible to medals, scars that run deeper than shrapnel and last longer than broken bones. The wounds of dawn assault are carved into souls with permanence that nothing can remove, are permanent modifications that transform Rangers into men fundamentally different from who they were before first light. We must honor these men, but honor without glorification. Without pretending war creates heroes rather than survivors. Rangers did not choose heroism. They chose duty. And when duty demanded heroism as the only path to survival, as the only way to protect brothers or live with themselves afterward, they delivered. This distinction matters because glorifying war creates the next generation of soldiers unprepared for war's reality. But honoring warriors, while refusing to sanitize their experience, preserves truth, protects memory, ensures we never forget the actual cost of freedom. B. Sledge testified with brutal honesty that war reveals how man can be lower than beasts or sublime in courage and sacrifice. Rangers at Dawn walked both edges. They saw the worst of humanity in what war demanded and embodied the best in their willingness to sacrifice for brothers. This duality is the truth we must hold. Rangers are not saints or monsters. They are men placed in impossible situations who found the strength to endure. Their legacy is not perfection but perseverance. Not glory but grit. Not sanitized heroism, but the complex reality of men who did what had to be done and carry the weight of having done it. What do we owe those who stand first in darkness so we may wake in safety? This question demands answering, demands action beyond platitudes and bumper stickers. We owe memory, real memory that refuses to sanitize or glorify. Memory that acknowledges what they endured, continues accumulating every day. We owe support, real support that manifests in resources and sustained commitment. Mental health care without stigma. Community that acknowledges their sacrifice without demanding they perform normalcy. We owe them freedom, to be wounded without being defined by wounds, to struggle without being considered weak, to grieve without being rushed toward healing they may never achieve. Rangers at Dawn remind us that freedom's price is always paid in full, in blood, in sanity, in souls forever changed by the weight of first light. This price is paid by volunteers who chose to stand between civilization and chaos. As you go about your day, remember this. Somewhere right now, Rangers are preparing for dawn, checking weapons in darkness, whispering prayers, accepting the burden of being first. They do this so you do not have to. This is their choice, their sacrifice, their dawn. Honor it. Remember it. Never take it for granted, in memory of all Rangers who stood first at dawn.